You check the number one more time. Same total. Same red digit that means there is less in that account than the fear you carry about it. You close the app. You open it again. Nothing changed in the 11 seconds between, but you needed to see it fail twice before you could stop pretending you had not seen it the first time. You call it a bad month. You call it the economy, the boss, the timing, the people who did not come through when they said they would. You have called it something different every month for years, and every month the something different has the same shape. You have never once stopped to ask why the shape stays the same while the excuse keeps changing clothes. This is not a story about money, and it was never going to be. It is about the room behind the room, the one where every circumstance you have ever blamed was built before it ever reached your hands. Nobody is coming to hand you a better life, but something in you built this one, board by board, thought by thought, and that means something in you can build another. You think you are waiting for things to change. You are not. Things have been changing this entire time, in exact and faithful obedience to something you have not yet agreed to look at. The moment you look at it, the waiting ends, whether you are ready or not. Based on the book As a Man Thinketh by James Allen and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The Weather You Made. The first sign never announces itself. It just keeps showing up, disguised as bad luck. Something has been happening to you for years, and you have been calling it by the wrong name. You wake up already behind. Not because the day did anything to you yet, it hasn't had the chance, but because the first thought that arrives is already tired, already bracing, already rehearsing an argument with a person who is not in the room. You get out of bed carrying a weather system nobody else can see, and you spend the next 16 hours acting as though the weather came from outside you. A slow driver becomes an insult. A short reply from a coworker becomes proof you're being frozen out. A bill becomes evidence that the world has decided to make things hard for you specifically, this month again. None of this feels like thinking. It feels like reacting to what's true. That's the trap. And it's a good one, because it never asks you to notice the thing doing the work underneath. Here is what nobody told you when you were young enough to hear it clean. The weather was never outside. You've been standing in a system you built and calling it forecast. Think about the last time something genuinely small ruined your afternoon. A text that took too long to arrive. A comment that could have meant nothing, and somehow meant everything by the time you finished turning it over. You didn't choose to feel that. It happened to you, fast, the way a stubbed toe happens to you. But feeling isn't where it started. Somewhere just before the feeling, so fast you missed it, there was a thought, one you've had 100 times before in 100 different outfits, and that thought did the actual damage. The circumstance only handed it a stage. This is the first sign, and it is easy to miss precisely because it is so small. Not a crisis, not a diagnosis. Just a pattern of interpretation running quietly under everything you call your life. Deciding in advance what the slow driver means, what the short reply means, what the bill means, before you've had a chance to look at any of it honestly. You have spent years treating your mind as a mirror. Something happens. The mirror shows it to you. You react to what you see. That's not what's happening. Your mind isn't a mirror. It's a lens. And lenses don't reflect. They shape. Two people can stand in the exact same room, receive the exact same email, hear the exact same silence from someone they love, and walk away holding two entirely different realities. The room didn't change between them. The lens did. You already know this is true somewhere. You've seen it in other people. The friend who turns every setback into a referendum on their worth. The one who somehow stays steady through things that would flatten you. You've called it personality, or resilience, or luck. You've never called it what it actually is, which is a habit of thought so old and so practiced that it no longer feels like a habit. It feels like the truth arriving on its own. Here's the part that's harder to sit with. If the lens shapes what you see, then the life built from what you see was never really happening to you. It was being assembled, decision by decision, thought by thought, mostly outside your awareness, mostly on repeat, mostly without your permission because you never knew permission was required. You didn't end up in the job that drains you by accident. You didn't end up in the relationship that keeps repeating the same argument by accident, something selected for it, quietly, long before the first date or the first interview, and that something has been running the whole time you thought you were the one deciding. This is not a comfortable idea, and it should not be. Comfortable ideas rarely change anything. If your circumstances are downstream of your thinking, then blame stops being useful, and blame is one of the most reliable comforts available to a tired mind. Blame lets you stay exactly where you are while feeling like you're doing something. Blame gives the discomfort a place to go that isn't you. That's not weakness, it's efficient. It's also the reason the pattern survives as long as it does. You might be telling yourself right now that your situation is different, that the boss really is difficult, that the market really is bad, that the person really did wrong you. Some of that may be entirely true. External conditions are real. Nobody is asking you to pretend the world is fair or that other people bear no responsibility for what they do. That's not the claim. The claim is narrower and harder to dismiss. Whatever is actually happening out there, you are the one deciding what it means, what it costs you, and what you do next. And that deciding has a shape you've never bothered to examine, because it has always felt less like a decision and more like the obvious response to obvious facts. It rarely is obvious. It's practiced. Picture the version of you from 10 years ago, standing in a version of this exact frustration, this exact financial squeeze, this exact sense of being let down by people who should have shown up. Different year, same shape. If the outside world were the whole explanation, the shape should have changed by now because the outside world has changed 100 times over. Different job, different city maybe, different people entirely. And still, somehow the shape came back. That repetition is not coincidence. It's a signature. It belongs to you, not to the decade. This is the sign you've been walking past for years without knowing it had a name. Not a single bad day. Not one hard month. A signature, written in the pattern of what keeps recurring no matter how much of the surrounding scenery gets replaced. There's a further distinction worth making here, one that will keep showing up in different clothes. Throughout this, there's a difference between what happened and what it cost you to believe about what happened. The slow driver cost you nothing. The interpretation that the slow driver was proof of a world working against you specifically, that cost you an afternoon of tension you carried into dinner, into a conversation with someone who had nothing to do with any of it. You have been paying for interpretations as though they were facts, and the bill never distinguishes between the two. You don't have to do anything with this yet. You don't have to fix it tonight, or explain it to anyone, or even fully believe it. All that's being asked of you right now is smaller, and, in its own way, more unsettling. The next time something ruins your afternoon, notice that it happened in 2 steps, not 1. The circumstance, and then the thought that met it. Most people only ever see the circumstance. You're not most people anymore. You just saw the second step. That's the whole system, cracked open half an inch. Not fixed, not solved, just visible for the first time, sitting where it's always been, waiting for you to finally look at it and ask the question you've spent years avoiding. If your thinking has been building this weather all along, what exactly have you been building? Chapter 2. The Room You Refuse to Enter. Cold curiosity. The thing you never let yourself look at straight on, finally named. You know the door is there. You've known for years. You just never turn the handle. Somewhere in you, filed under a heading you don't examine, is a list of things you already suspect about yourself, but have never said out loud. Not even alone. Not even at 3 in the morning when the house is quiet enough to hear your own thoughts without interference. You suspect the reason things keep falling apart isn't the people you keep choosing. You suspect the reason the money keeps disappearing isn't the economy. You suspect, somewhere below the part of you that talks, that you already know exactly what Chapter 1 was pointing at. And you've known it for longer than you'd like to admit. And still, every day, you walk past that door like it belongs to someone else's house. This isn't stupidity. It isn't even avoidance. Not the way people usually mean the word. It's something more efficient and more stubborn. A mind that has learned to look directly at the evidence and see something else instead, on purpose, without ever registering the substitution as a choice. Call it functional denial. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind where someone insists the doctor is wrong or the marriage is fine when it clearly isn't. This is quieter. This is the version that lets you nod along with an idea like, your thinking builds your life in the abstract. Agree with it as a concept. Even repeat it to a friend over coffee, while never once turning it toward the specific, unglamorous, embarrassing details of your own Tuesday. You can hold the truth as a general principle and keep it fully sealed off from your particular life. That sealing is not an accident. It's maintenance work, and you've been doing it for years without knowing you had a job. Here's how the maintenance actually runs. Something happens that should make the pattern obvious. The same argument with the same partner. The same excuse for missing the same deadline. And instead of asking what you keep contributing to the repetition, you reach for the nearest satisfying explanation that doesn't involve you. He's always been like this. That's just how the industry works. I never get a fair shot. Each explanation is plausible enough to survive a quick glance. None of them survive a slow one. But you never give them a slow one. Because a slow look might cost you the only story that lets you keep waking up without dread. This is the difference between not knowing and refusing to know. And it matters more than it sounds like it should. Not knowing is innocent. Refusing to know requires effort. Ongoing effort. The kind you don't notice you're spending because you've automated it. Every time the evidence gets close, some part of you reaches out and redirects the conversation before it arrives anywhere dangerous. You change the subject in your own head. You get busy. You reach for your phone at the exact moment the thought was about to land somewhere uncomfortable. And you call that boredom or tiredness, or a text that genuinely needed answering right then. Notice how well-timed that reach always is. You've done this in conversations too, maybe without ever naming it. Someone close to you says something true and small, something like, "You always do this when things get hard," and you feel the flash of it, that half-second recognition before the defense kicks in. And then you watch yourself deflect. Not because you disagree, because agreeing would mean the door opens, and you weren't ready. And some part of you decided in that half-second that you would rather be misunderstood than exposed. This is the part that's genuinely hard to hear, so it deserves to be said plainly instead of softened. The refusal isn't happening to you. You are the one doing it. Nobody handed you this defense mechanism fully built. You built it, thought by thought, the same way you built the weather from Chapter 1, and you built it for a reason that made sense at the time. Looking directly at your own contribution to your own suffering is genuinely painful. And pain avoidance is one of the oldest, most reliable operating systems a human mind has ever run. But there's a cost to the avoidance that never shows up on the invoice you actually read. Every day you don't open that door, the pattern gets to run one more time, unexamined, uncorrected, gathering the small confirming evidence that lets it feel more like fact and less like habit. The relationship repeats itself. The money repeats itself. The job repeats itself. And each repetition doesn't just cost you that one day. It reinforces the wiring that guarantees the next repetition, and the one after that, until the pattern isn't something you have anymore, it's something you are. Here's a distinction worth sitting with because it changes what this actually requires of you. There's a difference between confronting a truth and confessing to a crime. You've been treating this like the second one, which is why you avoid it the way you'd avoid a courtroom. But you are not on trial here. Nobody is asking you to establish guilt or hand down a sentence. What's being asked is smaller and stranger. Just walk to the door. Not through it yet. Just close enough to put your hand on the handle without turning it. Consider how differently this looks from outside your own head. To someone watching, you don't appear to be refusing anything. You appear busy, reasonable, occupied with legitimate concerns that happen to arrive at exactly the moments a harder question was forming. Nobody around you sees the redirect happening, because the redirect was never designed to be visible to anyone but the part of you doing it. And even that part has learned to disguise its own handiwork so well that most days you believe the disguise yourself. This is worth knowing, not because it should make you feel exposed, but because it explains why nobody has ever been able to talk you out of the pattern from the outside. You cannot argue someone out of a mechanism they cannot see themselves running. You might have to do this several times before you actually open anything. That's not failure. That's how doors that have been sealed for years actually work. You don't kick them down. You come back to them again and again, hand on the handle, until one day the resistance is a little less than it was the day before, and you realize you've been building the courage the same slow, invisible way you built the avoidance. Thought by thought. Return by return. Somewhere tonight, something small will happen that has your name on it and someone else's face attached. A comment that stings more than it should. A moment where you feel the old excuse rising, ready-made, familiar, comfortable as an old coat. You'll have a choice in that half-second, the same half-second where the deflection usually happens automatically. You don't have to open the door yet. You just have to notice your hand reaching for the coat instead, and let it hang there a moment before you put it on. That noticing is not nothing. It is, in fact, the only thing that has ever mattered here. The door was never locked. You were the one standing against it, and you've been so good at it for so long that you forgot you were the one applying the pressure. Chapter 3. The name for what you've always felt. Revelation of the mechanism. Understanding without resolution. Not yet. There is a word for this, and once you hear it, you will not be able to unhear it. You've felt it your whole life, without having language for it. That sense, arriving usually late at night or right before something important, that you are somehow always cast in the same role, no matter which stage you're standing on. New job, same feeling of being overlooked. New city, same feeling of being on the outside of something everyone else was let into. You've called it bad luck, timing, other people's failures to see your value. Tonight you get the actual name, and the name is going to feel like it was always sitting a few inches away from your mouth, waiting for you to reach it. Psychologists call part of this confirmation bias, but that clinical phrase doesn't carry the weight of what it actually does to a life. So here's the plainer version. Your mind does not experience the world and then form beliefs about it. Your mind holds beliefs first, old ones, built years ago from evidence you barely remember collecting. And then it goes looking for the world that proves them right. It isn't lying to you. It's doing exactly what it was built to do, which is protect the model it already trusts over building a new one from scratch every single day. But the model it's protecting was assembled by a much younger, much more frightened version of you. And nobody ever came back to check whether that version got it right. Think about the specific belief running underneath your particular repetition. Maybe it's something like, people leave when things get hard. Maybe it's, I have to earn my place or I'll lose it. Maybe it's nobody's going to rescue you, so don't bother hoping. You didn't choose this belief consciously. Nobody sits a child down and installs a worldview on purpose. It arrived through 100 small moments that felt unrelated at the time. A parent who was present in body but absent in attention. A friendship that ended without explanation. A room where you learned that asking for help cost more than it was worth. Each moment was small. The residue was not. Here is where the mechanism gets its teeth. Once that belief exists, your mind stops being a neutral witness to your life and becomes something closer to a lawyer building a case it already knows the verdict to. It doesn't search for the truth. It searches for confirmation, and it's extraordinarily good at finding it, because almost anything can be read as confirmation if you're only looking for one kind of evidence. Someone doesn't respond to a message right away, and the belief says, see, they're already pulling back. Someone gives you feedback at work, and the belief says, see, you have to earn it every time. Nothing is ever just given. The belief doesn't need much. It only needs a plausible fit. And the world offers plausible fits constantly, to everyone, about everything. This is why simply trying harder has never worked for you. And it's worth pausing on that failure instead of rushing past it, because you've probably blamed yourself for it more than once. You've tried being more agreeable so people wouldn't leave. You've tried overperforming so you wouldn't have to earn your place twice. You've tried, in 100 quiet ways, to defeat the belief through better behavior. And it hasn't worked, not permanently, because you were fighting the belief on the field where it always wins. Behavior can't out-argue a lens. The lens decides what the behavior even means before you've finished performing it. Here's a distinction that matters more than it looks like it should. There's a difference between a fear and a frame. A fear is an event, sharp, specific. It comes and it eventually passes. A frame doesn't come and go. It sits underneath everything, quietly deciding what counts as evidence long before you're aware a decision got made. You've spent years trying to manage your fears one at a time, exhausting yourself putting out fires without ever noticing that the same architect kept building new ones from the same blueprint. You weren't failing to solve the problem. You were solving the wrong layer of it over and over, and calling the exhaustion proof that you just needed to try harder next time. Sit with something uncomfortable for a moment. If your mind is built to find evidence for what it already believes, then the version of your life you're currently living, the relationships that keep disappointing you in the same way, the opportunities that keep almost arriving and then don't, isn't proof that the world is what you fear it is. It's proof that you've been an extremely effective researcher for a hypothesis you never chose to test. You've gathered years of data. The data is real. The conclusion built from it may not be. This does not mean the pain wasn't real. People really did leave. Money really did run out. Someone really did make you feel small in a room where you deserved better. None of this is being denied, and nobody is asking you to pretend those moments didn't happen the way they happened. What's being named is something underneath the moments. The reason. The same shape of moment kept finding you across different people, different decades, different circumstances that had no reason to rhyme with each other, except for the one thing they all had in common, which was you standing in the middle of them, carrying the same frame into every new room. This same mechanism explains why arguing with someone else's frame rarely works either. You can hand a person every piece of contrary evidence available and watch them file it under exception rather than correction, because the frame was never built by evidence in the first place. It was built by fear. Wearing evidence as a costume, and costumes are easy to swap without ever touching what's underneath them. You might want the fix right now. You might be reading this and mentally reaching for the part where the mechanism gets dismantled, where you're handed the 3 steps that undo years of pattern in an evening. That part isn't here yet, and it shouldn't be, because a frame this old doesn't loosen because you understood it intellectually at 11 at night while reading. Understanding is the doorway, not the room. You're standing in the doorway right now. That's further than you've stood in years. Here's what you can do tonight, and it's smaller than you want it to be. The next time something happens that triggers the old feeling, the one that says, see, this again, don't try to fix it and don't try to argue yourself out of it. Just ask one question, quietly, to yourself. What would I have to believe about myself for this moment to mean what I think it means right now? Don't answer it yet. Just ask it. Let it sit there, unanswered, the way a held breath sits in the chest right before you finally let it go. You've been calling this bad luck for years. It has a name now, and the name is not a life sentence. It's a signature, written by a much younger hand, and signatures can be rewritten by the hand that's holding the pen today. You just have to notice you're still holding it. Chapter 4. The Bill You Never Opened. Honest weight. The real cost, without spectacle. Nobody hands you the invoice for this. You write it yourself, in installments, and you've been paying it for so long you stopped noticing the withdrawal. Picture your bank account for a second, not the money, the habit of checking it. You know the exact feeling of opening that app with your stomach already tight, bracing for a number before you've even seen it. That bracing didn't start with the account. It started years earlier with a different kind of ledger, one that tracks something far more expensive than money and never sends a statement. Here is the actual cost of the frame you've been carrying since Chapter 3, laid out plainly instead of hinted at. It is not the argument you had last Tuesday. It is not the job you didn't get. Those are line items, and line items are survivable on their own. The real cost is compound. Every time the belief gets confirmed, however small the confirmation, it doesn't just cost you that moment. It reduces the size of the next opportunity you're willing to reach for, quietly, without asking your permission first. Think about the invitation you didn't send last month, the idea you didn't pitch, the person you didn't call back because some part of you had already decided how it would go before it went anywhere. You told yourself you were being realistic. Being realistic and protecting an old frame can look identical from the inside, and that resemblance is the entire reason the cost stays invisible for so long. You don't experience it as fear. You experience it as good judgment, and good judgment doesn't feel like something you should question. This is the part almost nobody says out loud, so say it to yourself now, plainly. You have not been living a smaller life because your circumstances forced you into it. You have been living a smaller life because the frame kept editing your circumstances down to a size it already trusted, and you signed off on the edits without reading them, the way you scroll past terms and conditions to get to the part where you actually wanted to go. There's a distinction worth holding here, because it changes how you weigh what's been lost. There's a difference between a setback and a ceiling. A setback happens to you from outside, a bad year, an unfair boss, a diagnosis nobody saw coming. A ceiling is something you build from inside, and then live underneath so consistently you forget it was ever built at all. You've likely spent years treating your ceiling like a setback, waiting for conditions to improve when the actual structure limiting you was never conditional. It was architectural. Weather doesn't remove a ceiling, only demolition does. Here's where the cost gets harder to face, and it deserves to be faced directly instead of softened for comfort. Every year you spend protecting the old belief instead of testing it is a year you cannot get back in any form. Not with money, not with apology, not with a better year next year. Time spent confirming a frame doesn't just fail to build anything. It actively constructs the evidence that will make the frame feel even more true 12 months from now than it does tonight. The debt doesn't sit still. It accrues interest, and the interest is paid in the specific currency of chances you stopped taking because some part of you had already decided how they'd end. There's a further cost worth naming, one that rarely makes it onto any accounting because it never looks like loss while it's happening. Every year the ceiling stays up and the people around you adjust to it too, quietly recalibrating what they expect from you, what they ask of you, what they assume you're capable of. They are not doing this to limit you. They are simply responding to the size of life you've been showing them, because that's the only size they have any evidence for. The ceiling doesn't just shrink your own sense of what's possible. It teaches everyone around you the same shrunken map.
and they begin building their expectations of you on top of it, which makes the ceiling even harder to see, let alone remove, because by now it isn't only yours. It's shared. You might be tempted right now to total this up, to sit with a pen and calculate exactly how much this has cost you across every year you can remember, every relationship shortened, every raise you didn't ask for, every room you left early because staying felt like risking something you weren't ready to name. Resist that instinct tonight. Grief done as accounting turns into self-punishment fast. And self-punishment is just the old frame wearing a new, more respectable outfit. It will tell you this is accountability. It is not. It is the same voice that built the ceiling, now trying to convince you that suffering over the ceiling is somehow different from living under it. What actually matters here is smaller and less dramatic than a full accounting, and it's the only part worth doing tonight. Somewhere in the last year, there was a specific moment where you pulled back from something you wanted, and you called it practicality. Find that moment. Don't judge it. Just look at it clearly, the way you'd look at a bill you've been avoiding, and notice what it actually cost, not in money, in the particular shape of the life that didn't get to happen because of it. This is not about blame, and it needs to be said again, because the old frame is very good at converting honest reckoning into self-attack the moment your guard drops. You built this ceiling as a child, with the tools a child has, which is to say almost none, in a room you didn't choose, in response to people and circumstances you had no power over. The ceiling made sense then. It kept something in you safe when safety wasn't guaranteed by anyone bigger than you. The problem was never that you built it. The problem is that nobody ever came back to tell you it was safe to take it down, so you kept maintaining it long after the danger that justified it was gone. Here's the honest weight, stated once, plainly, without softening. You have been paying a debt that came due decades ago, on a loan you never chose to take out, to a version of the world that no longer exists in the way it did when the terms were set. The person who hurt you back then may not even remember doing it. The room that taught you asking for help costs too much has been empty for years, and still the payments keep going out, automatic, monthly, drawn from an account that was supposed to be funding your actual life. You don't have to fix this tonight. Nobody fixes a debt this old in one sitting, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What you can do is stop pretending the statement isn't in your mailbox. Open it. Read the number. Let it be exactly as large as it actually is. No smaller, no larger, no editorializing. The weight was always real. What's new is that you're finally the one holding it, instead of it holding you without your knowledge. That's not nothing. That's the first honest breath you've taken about this in years. Chapter 5. The Attempts That Were Never Actually Yours. Failure understood, not through weakness, through wrong tools. You have tried before, more than once. Stop letting anyone, including yourself, pretend otherwise. There was the January you built the spreadsheet, color-coded, ambitious, honest about every dollar for the first time in years. There was the year you went to therapy every Wednesday for 11 months straight and said things out loud you'd never said to anyone. There was the relationship where you promised yourself, silently in the car before the first date, that this time you'd stay open instead of guarded. You gave real effort to all of it. And still, somehow you ended up back here, reading a chapter about the pattern you thought you'd already broken. Here is what nobody told you at the time, and it's worth hearing now instead of letting the old verdict stand unchallenged. You didn't fail because you lacked discipline. You failed because you were using tools built for the wrong layer of the problem, and no amount of force applied to the wrong layer ever reaches the one underneath it. Think about the spreadsheet. It tracked dollars. It never once asked what the belief underneath the spending was doing, the one that said, money disappears no matter what you do, so why bother holding it tightly? You can build the most accurate tracking system in the world and still watch it fail against a frame that was never about arithmetic in the first place. The spreadsheet assumed the problem lived in your behavior. The problem lived one floor down, in the belief deciding what your behavior would eventually become, no matter how carefully you planned it. This is the mechanism behind almost every attempt you've made that didn't stick. You treated a structural issue with a behavioral fix, and behavioral fixes are visible, measurable, satisfying to build, which is exactly why you reached for one. Nobody hands you a spreadsheet for dismantling a belief installed by a room you left 20 years ago. So you reached for the tool that existed instead of the one you actually needed. And when it didn't hold, you concluded something about your own willpower rather than something about the tool. There's a distinction that matters here, one you've probably never made explicitly. There's a difference between motivation and mechanism. Motivation is the feeling that gets you to start. Mechanism is the actual structure doing the work once the feeling runs out, which it always does, usually around week 3, right on schedule, the way it has every single time you've tried this before. You've spent years blaming yourself for losing motivation, as though motivation was ever supposed to carry the whole distance. It was never built for that job. It's an ignition system, not an engine. If nothing else takes over once the spark fades, of course the car stops. That was never a character flaw, that was physics. Consider the therapy year, because it deserves more honesty than you've probably given it. Something real happened there. You said things out loud that had been sealed for a decade. You cried in a room where crying didn't cost you anything for the first time in your adult life. And still, 6 months after it ended, you found yourself back in a version of the same argument with a different person, wearing a different face but speaking in the exact same rhythm you'd sworn you were done with. Does that mean the therapy failed? No. It means insight and behavior are two different rooms in the same house, connected by a hallway most people never walk down. Because walking it requires something insight alone can't provide. Repetition, under pressure, in real conditions, long after the initial understanding has gone quiet. This is the part that's hardest to hear, so it deserves to be said without cushioning. Understanding the mechanism the way Chapter 3 named it is necessary, and it is nowhere close to sufficient. You can know exactly why you do something and still do it again tomorrow. Because knowing lives in one part of you and acting lives in another, and the bridge between them isn't built by insight. It's built by practice, the unglamorous, repetitive, often invisible kind, applied specifically at the moment the old pattern tries to run, not in the calm safety of a Wednesday session where nothing is actually at stake. You are not the first person to mistake understanding for change. It's one of the most common traps there is, precisely because understanding feels like progress, feels like relief, feels like the hard part is finally over. It isn't over. It's the map. Nobody has ever arrived anywhere by studying a map without walking. Here's what actually explains the relationship, since it deserves its own honest look too. You promised yourself you'd stay open. You meant it, fully, in the car, before anything had tested that promise yet. Promises made in calm conditions rarely survive contact with the actual moment they were built for, because the moment arrives disguised, small, deniable. It's not a dramatic betrayal that tests you. It's a slightly late text, a slightly cold tone, a silence that goes on 4 seconds longer than it should. In that exact moment, the old frame doesn't announce itself. It just quietly takes the wheel the way it always has, faster than the promise you made in the car ever had a chance to intervene. This is the actual reason none of it held. And it's a relief to finally hear it stated plainly instead of dressed up as a character flaw. You were never lazy. You were never weak. You were applying real effort to a target that kept moving one layer deeper than wherever you aimed. The spreadsheet aimed at behavior. The therapy aimed at insight. The promise aimed at willpower. None of them on their own aimed at the actual mechanism, the automatic reflex that fires faster than any of those 3 tools can reach every single time, unless something is built specifically to meet it at that speed. There's a related distinction worth naming. because it will save you from repeating the exact mistake with whatever tool comes next. There's a difference between a tool that fails and a tool applied at the wrong depth. A hammer isn't a bad tool because it can't tighten a screw. It was simply never built for that job, and blaming the hammer, or blaming yourself for reaching for it, misses the actual lesson, which is to learn what each layer of a problem actually requires before reaching for whatever's closest at hand. The spreadsheet wasn't wrong. It was answering a question nobody asked. The real question was always one layer beneath the one it was built to solve. You don't yet have that something. You're about to. But before you get there, sit for a moment with what this chapter actually removes. It removes the verdict you've been quietly carrying about yourself for years. The one that says you just don't follow through. You just don't have what it takes. You just aren't built for this the way other people seem to be. That verdict was never accurate. It was just the nearest available explanation for a failure that had a different cause entirely. One you didn't have the tools to see until now. The tools you used were real. They just weren't aimed at the room the problem actually lives in. You're standing closer to that room than you've ever stood before. Chapter 6. The First Real Move. Energy of someone seeing a way out for the first time. Not solved yet, but moving. Something shifts the first time you catch it in real time instead of afterward. Not in the retelling. Not in the version you replay in the shower 2 hours later, wishing you'd said something different. In the actual moment while it's happening, while the old reflex is still mid-motion and hasn't finished landing yet. That's the only place any of this ever actually changes. And until tonight, you may not have known that place existed. Here is what it looks like in practice, small enough to almost miss. Someone sends a message that lands wrong. Not cruel, just off, a little short, a little late. In the old sequence, the one you've run 1,000 times without noticing you were running it, the interpretation and the reaction arrive fused together as one single event, so fast there was never a gap to step into. The message lands, and half a second later you're already composing the version of reality where this confirms what you always suspected. No pause. No choosing. Just the reflex, executing itself the way it always has. Tonight, for the first time, imagine catching the half-second between them. Not stopping it, not defeating it. Just seeing it. The way you'd notice a familiar smell before you could name where it was coming from. Oh, there it is. That's the whole move, and it is far bigger than it sounds, because for years that gap was invisible to you. The interpretation and the event felt like one thing. They were never one thing. There has always been a seam between what happened and what you decided it meant, and you are, for the first time, close enough to actually see the seam. This is not the same as fixing the reaction. You will still feel the old pull. The belief that says, see, this confirms it doesn't go quiet just because you noticed it arriving. What changes is smaller, and in its way more important than silencing it. You now know it's a voice, not a verdict. A voice can be heard without being obeyed. A verdict can't. You've been treating this voice as a verdict for so long that hearing it as a voice for the first time will feel almost disorienting, like turning on a light in a room you'd only ever known by feel. There's a distinction worth naming here, because it explains why this first move matters more than it looks like it should. There's a difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is instant, automatic, indistinguishable from truth in the moment it happens. Responding requires a gap, however small, between the stimulus and what you do next. You have spent years reacting and calling it responding, because the gap was never wide enough to notice it was missing. Tonight, the gap doesn't need to be wide. It needs to exist. Half a second is enough. Half a second is where everything from here forward is actually going to happen. You might wonder why this matters more than a bigger, more decisive move, the kind you've tried before, the dramatic overhaul, the total reinvention. Here's why. Every attempt you've made that didn't hold, the spreadsheet, the promise in the car, had tried to skip past this gap entirely and operate at the level of behavior instead. But behavior is downstream. The gap is upstream, closer to the source. And anything built upstream changes everything that flows from it without needing to be forced downstream, one decision at a time. You don't have to win every individual moment for the rest of your life. You have to learn to see the seam, reliably, and the moments start handling themselves differently once you do. Consider what happens differently the next time the message lands wrong. You feel the old pull, exactly as strong as always, because feeling it fade on command was never realistic and isn't the goal. But this time, in the half-second before you would have reacted, something in you notices the pull arriving instead of simply being carried by it. That noticing doesn't erase the feeling. It just adds a witness to it, and a witness changes the room, the way a single sober person changes a party even without saying a word. This is genuinely new. Not because the feeling is different. Because you are now, for maybe the first time in years, present for your own reaction instead of simply being it. It helps to understand why half a second is the right unit of measurement here, rather than a minute, or an hour, or a full conversation. The old reflex operates faster than deliberate thought, which is exactly why it has always felt less like a choice and more like an instant fact about reality. You were never going to outthink it with a longer pause you don't actually have access to in the heat of the moment. What you can access, with practice, is the narrow gap that exists between stimulus and story. The sliver of time before the interpretation fully forms and hardens into something that feels indistinguishable from truth. That sliver has always been there. You simply never had a reason to look for something that small. Think of it the way a photographer thinks about the moment right before the shutter closes, the fraction of a second where the scene is still being composed rather than already fixed on film. Once the shutter closes, the image is set, and arguing with a photograph is pointless. But before it closes, there's still movement, still possibility, still a version of the scene that hasn't been locked into permanence yet. The half-second you're learning to notice is that same narrow window. The space before the story about what just happened gets developed and printed and filed away as simply what occurred. You are learning to catch the shutter before it closes, not to prevent the photograph from ever being taken, but to have some say in what actually gets captured. Here's a fragment worth expanding rather than shrinking down into a slogan. This is not about becoming someone who never gets triggered. That version of you doesn't exist, and chasing it will exhaust you the same way the spreadsheet did, aiming effort at the wrong target dressed up in new language. The goal was never numbness. The goal was distance. The specific kind of distance that lets you see the old reflex clearly enough to choose whether to follow it, rather than discovering you already followed it once the damage was done. Tonight you don't need a plan for every future trigger. You need exactly one thing. The next time something lands wrong, however small, notice the half-second before the story starts writing itself. That's the entire assignment, and it's smaller than anything you've tried before, which is precisely why it might be the first one that actually works. You've spent your whole life inside the reaction, mistaking it for the whole of you. Tonight you get to stand just outside it for half a second, watching it happen instead of being entirely made of it. That half-second is where the rest of this begins. None of this requires you to feel ready. Readiness was never a precondition for noticing something that's already happening in front of you. You don't wait until you feel prepared to see a shutter closing. You simply happen to be looking at the right moment, or you don't. And the only thing that changes the odds of looking at the right moment is practice at looking in general, applied without waiting for the perfect conditions to arrive first. Chapter 7. The Voice That Sounds Like Protection. Internal resistance, named with clarity, without romance. It's going to fight you, and it's going to sound reasonable when it does. You noticed the half-second in Chapter 6. You saw the seam. That should feel like progress, and it is. But here's what nobody tells you about the first real movement toward change. Something in you notices it too, and it does not welcome the news. Give it a few days, maybe less. You'll be sitting somewhere ordinary, doing something unrelated. And a thought will arrive that sounds nothing like resistance. It'll sound like wisdom, something closer to maybe this isn't really the problem. Maybe you're overthinking a normal reaction. Other people feel this way too. You're not broken. Why are you trying to fix something that was never actually broken in the first place? It will arrive gently, reasonably, in a voice that sounds remarkably like your own good judgment, because that's exactly what it's designed to sound like. This is the part almost nobody names accurately, so name it now, plainly. The voice talking you out of the half-second is not stupidity, and it is not weakness. It is the exact same mechanism from Chapter 3, the one that spent years finding evidence for an old belief, now doing the only thing it knows how to do when its evidence gathering gets interrupted. It defends itself, not because it wants to hurt you, because as far as it's concerned, it's been keeping you safe this entire time. And safety doesn't hand over its post without a fight, however outdated the danger it was originally built to guard against. Think about what actually happens biologically in a moment like this, because it explains why the resistance feels so convincing instead of obviously wrong. A belief that's run unopposed for 20 years isn't stored like a fact you memorized. It's stored more like a habit of perception, wired in at a level that operates faster than conscious reasoning. When you interrupt it, even once, even for half a second, it registers less like an idea being questioned and more like a threat to the whole operating system. The discomfort you feel isn't a sign you're doing this wrong. It's a sign you're doing it correctly enough for the old system to notice. Here's a distinction worth sitting with, because confusing these two will cost you the progress from the last chapter. There's a difference between resistance and truth. Resistance feels like truth from the inside. That's the entire reason it survives as long as it does, but the two are not the same thing, and you can learn to tell them apart if you know what to look for. Truth tends to arrive quiet, and stays quiet under examination. Resistance arrives loud, urgent, and gets louder the closer you get to actually testing it. If a thought escalates the moment you try to look at it directly, that escalation is information. Truth doesn't need volume. Only defense does. You will likely notice the resistance showing up in at least one of a few familiar disguises, and it helps to recognize them by shape rather than by content, because the content changes every time, while the shape stays remarkably consistent. Sometimes it arrives as sudden exhaustion, a wave of tiredness that shows up right when you were about to sit with something uncomfortable, conveniently making rest feel more urgent than the half-second you were trying to practice. Sometimes it arrives as busyness, an unusually strong pull toward errands and tasks that have waited patiently for months, and suddenly feel urgent tonight specifically. Sometimes it arrives as doubt about the whole process itself, a feeling that this was never going to work anyway, so why keep bothering? None of these are signs you should stop. They're signs you're close enough to something real that a part of you felt the need to intervene. Consider the moment this actually gets tested, not in theory but in your actual week. Someone says something that lands the old way, and this time you catch the half-second, the way you practiced. And right behind the catching comes a second voice, fast, almost overlapping with the first, saying something like, "This is exhausting. Can't you just react like a normal person for once? Does every single moment have to be a whole examination?" That second voice is not your enemy, and treating it as an enemy will cost you energy you don't need to spend. It's an old guard doing its job the only way it knows how, confused about why the post it's been holding for 20 years suddenly has someone new standing at the door. Here's what actually works against it, and it's smaller than a battle plan, because a battle plan assumes a fight you don't need to win outright tonight. You don't have to argue with the voice. You don't have to prove it wrong, defeat it, or silence it permanently in one sitting. All that's required is what you already practiced in Chapter 6. Notice it arriving. the way you'd notice weather changing, without needing the weather to stop before you decide whether to bring an umbrella. Let the voice say what it's going to say. You are not obligated to obey everything that speaks convincingly. It's worth noticing, too, that the voice rarely attacks the conclusion directly. It almost never says outright that you should give up. It's subtler than that, and more effective for being subtler. It questions the premise instead, suggesting the whole project was unnecessary in the first place, that you were fine before you started paying this much attention, that other people manage their lives without this kind of constant internal audit and seem happier for it. This is a more sophisticated defense than simple refusal because it doesn't ask you to fight it. It asks you to agree that there was never anything worth fighting. Recognize this version when it arrives. It is the same guard, wearing a calmer uniform. There's something important underneath this that deserves to be said directly. The resistance showing up at all is not evidence you're failing. It's evidence you finally got close enough to something real for it to notice you. A pattern that's been running unchallenged for decades doesn't defend itself against nothing. It defends itself against a genuine threat to its continued operation. And for the first time in a long time, that threat is you, awake, half a second earlier than you used to be. You are not going to feel triumphant the first several times this happens. You're going to feel tired, unsure, occasionally embarrassed by how convincing the old voice still sounds, even after everything you now understand about where it comes from. That's normal. That's not a sign the work isn't taking. It's a sign you're standing exactly where change actually happens, which was never going to be a comfortable place to stand, no matter how much you understood in advance. The voice telling you to stop has been running this operation for longer than you've been consciously aware of it existing. It is not going to hand over control because you asked politely once. It's going to keep talking. Your job was never to make it stop. Your job is to keep noticing that it's talking, and keep choosing anyway. Chapter 8. The Day Nothing Goes Right. Persistence under pressure. Applying it exactly when everything conspires against you. Tonight isn't a good night to practice this. That's exactly why it matters that you do. You know the kind of day already because you've lived 100 versions of it. The alarm didn't go off, or it did, and you ignored it twice. Traffic ran long, someone at work said something clipped, and you didn't have the bandwidth to wonder whether it meant anything. By the time you're standing in your kitchen at 9 at night, staring into a refrigerator you have no intention of actually using, you are not the version of yourself who caught the half-second in Chapter 6. You are tired in the specific way that makes every old reflex feel not just available, but justified. This is the day the pattern comes back for you, and it picks its timing with something close to precision. Not on the calm Tuesday when you had energy to spare and the half-second felt almost easy to catch. On the day your reserves are already spent. That's not coincidence, and it's worth understanding why. Because misunderstanding it is what convinces most people to quit right here, at the exact moment quitting costs the most. The half-second you practiced in Chapter 6 takes energy. Not much, but some. The same way holding a door open against wind takes more effort than letting it swing shut. On a good day, with reserves to spare, that effort barely registers. On a day like tonight, with nothing left in the tank, the door swings shut fast, and it will feel less like failure and more like relief, because for one exhausted moment, going back to the old reflex is genuinely easier than doing anything else. Here's what nobody tells you about this specific kind of night, and it changes how you should think about what's actually happening. Low energy doesn't just make the old pattern more likely. It makes the old pattern feel more true. Exhaustion strips away the small margin of doubt that usually keeps the belief in check. The quiet awareness that maybe this interpretation isn't the only one available. Tired, that margin disappears, and the old story arrives with a certainty it doesn't actually deserve, dressed up as simple honesty because you're too depleted to notice the costume.
You will be tempted, on a night like this, to treat the return of the old pattern as proof that nothing from the last 7 chapters actually worked. That temptation is worth naming directly, because it's wrong, and believing it wrong costs you more than the bad night itself. A single hard night reactivating an old reflex isn't evidence the work failed. It's evidence the work was never designed to make you immune. Nothing built in 7 chapters erases 20 years of wiring on a night when you have no reserves left to draw on. That was never the promise, however much some part of you wanted it to be. There's a distinction that matters here, and it's easy to miss when you're this tired to make it carefully. There's a difference between relapse and information. Relapse implies you're back to where you started, that none of the previous progress counted, that tonight erases the 6 chapters before it. Information means something different and considerably more useful. Tonight is data about exactly when the pattern is strongest, and that data is worth more than a calm Tuesday will ever give you, because calm Tuesdays were never the actual test. Tired, depleted, cornered nights were always the real exam. You just took it early, before you expected to. There's something worth understanding about why exhausted nights specifically tend to arrive in clusters rather than evenly spread across your life. Depletion rarely comes from nowhere. It usually comes from a stretch of days where you were already spending more of yourself than you had, on deadlines, on other people's needs, on problems that demanded attention you didn't have spare. By the time the old pattern shows up asking to run again, it isn't choosing a random moment. It's arriving at the exact point where your defenses were already thinnest, the same way illness tends to find you not on an ordinary Tuesday, but during the week you were already run down from something else entirely. Knowing this in advance doesn't prevent the exhausted night from happening, but it does let you recognize it for what it is when it arrives, a predictable consequence of depletion, not a mysterious return of something you thought you'd already handled. The pattern was never gone. It was simply waiting for a night when your usual defenses would be too tired to notice it walking back in. Consider what it would look like to lower the bar on a night like this deliberately, without shame attached to the lowering. On a good day, the goal is catching the half-second cleanly, noticing the seam before the reaction runs. Tonight the goal is smaller, and smaller is not a failure, it's calibration. Tonight the goal might simply be noticing the reaction after it's already happened. 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, standing in the kitchen finally admitting to yourself what just occurred. That's not the clean catch from Chapter 6. It's a delayed one. It still counts, because the entire mechanism runs on noticing eventually happening at all, not on noticing happening instantly every single time from here forward. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because most people abandon change exactly here, on the first hard night, having quietly decided that anything less than a perfect catch means the whole effort has failed. That decision is not accuracy. It's exhaustion talking, borrowing the language of failure, because failure is a familiar, well-worn story, and this new uncertain path is not. Here's something worth carrying into nights like this one specifically. The old pattern isn't testing whether you're capable of permanent vigilance. Nobody is capable of that, and building toward it would only recreate the same exhausting perfectionism that burned you out on every previous attempt. What's actually being built here is something closer to a muscle that gets stronger through exactly this kind of repeated, imperfect use, not through flawless execution on easy days. A muscle doesn't grow from the rep you did with plenty of energy left. It grows from the rep you finished when you didn't think you had one left to give. Tonight, standing in your kitchen, tired in the way that makes everything feel more true than it is, you don't need to catch this perfectly. You need only one thing, small enough to actually manage even now. Before you go to sleep, name what happened. Not to fix it. Not to analyze it at length you don't have energy for. Just name it plainly, to yourself. That was the old pattern, running because I was exhausted, not because it was suddenly right again. That single sentence,
said honestly on a night when everything else in you wanted to skip it, does more than a dozen easy catches on days when catching barely cost you anything. The pattern chose tonight because tonight it thought you wouldn't be watching. You were. Barely, late, imperfectly. That's still watching. Chapter 9. The Pattern in the Presence of Someone Else. Relational expansion. The pattern doesn't run alone, it runs in company. You have never actually practiced this alone. You just thought you did. Every chapter so far has walked you through the mechanism as though it lived entirely inside your own skull, a private architecture you could dismantle in solitude, 1/2 second at a time. That was necessary because you had to see the machinery before you could see what happens to the machinery in the presence of another person. But the truth is, the pattern was never built for solitude. It was built in rooms with other people in them, and it runs fastest, hardest, and with the least warning, when someone else is standing close enough to trigger it in real time. Think about the last time this actually happened with someone you love. Not a stranger, not a coworker you can walk away from at 5 o'clock. Someone whose face you know well enough to read in half a glance, whose silence you've learned to interpret before they've finished being silent. That person says something small, maybe not even unkind, just slightly off in tone, and something in you reacts before you've consciously registered a single word of what they said. The 1/2 second from Chapter 6 doesn't just get harder here. It nearly disappears, because the person standing in front of you isn't an abstract trigger. They're wired directly into the oldest version of the belief you're working against. Here's why this specific setting collapses the gap you worked so hard to build. Every belief traced back in Chapter 3 was installed in relationship, not in isolation. Nobody develops the conviction that people leave when things get hard by sitting alone in a room. That belief was built by an actual person leaving or withdrawing, or going quiet at exactly the moment you needed them present. Which means the people closest to you now aren't neutral bystanders to your pattern. They're standing in the exact position the belief was originally built to watch for, and your nervous system knows this even when your conscious mind has forgotten it. This explains something that has probably confused you for years. You can hold the 1/2 second cleanly with a stranger, a rude driver, an anonymous email, and lose it completely with the one person whose opinion actually matters to you. That's not inconsistency. That's precision. The pattern isn't randomly triggered. It's specifically calibrated to fire hardest exactly where the original wound sits. And the original wound almost never sits with strangers. There's a distinction worth naming here, because confusing it will cost you the relationship you're trying to protect. There's a difference between a person and a role. The person standing in front of you tonight is an individual, with their own tiredness, their own bad day, their own unrelated reasons for the tone they just used. The role is older, cast decades ago, filled by whoever was closest to you when the belief first formed. When the reaction fires fast and hot, you are very often not responding to the person. You're responding to the role, and the person just happened to be standing in the doorway when the old scene started replaying. This is worth sitting with directly, because it reframes something you've probably misjudged for years. When your partner's slightly clipped tone sends you spiraling into certainty that they're pulling away, you're not overreacting to them specifically. You're reacting at full strength to someone else entirely, someone from decades ago. And the person in front of you is simply close enough right now to catch the reaction meant for someone who isn't even in the room. Consider what this means for the other person, because they experience the collapse of your 1/2 second very differently than you do. They don't see the old belief firing. They don't see the childhood room, the original withdrawal, the years of confirmation that built the reflex. They see you, in this moment, reacting to something that, from where they're standing, doesn't match what actually happened. This is often where relationships genuinely suffer, not because either person is doing something wrong exactly, but because one person is fighting a battle from decades ago, while the other person is simply standing in today, confused about which war they've apparently been drafted into. Here's what becomes possible once you can see this clearly, and it doesn't require the other person to understand any of it for it to work. The next time the reaction fires hard and fast with someone close to you, before you speak, before you act on the certainty, ask one question silently. Is this the size of what just happened, or the size of what happened decades ago? You will feel, almost immediately, which one it is. The proportion gives it away every time. A response calibrated to today rarely arrives at full volume. A response calibrated to the original wound almost always does, because it isn't actually responding to today at all. This doesn't mean every strong reaction is automatically old, and every calm one is automatically accurate. Sometimes the person in front of you really has done something that deserves a real response, and dismissing your own reaction as just an old pattern can become its own kind of avoidance, a way of never holding anyone accountable for anything. The goal isn't to distrust every feeling. The goal is to ask the proportion question honestly, every time, and let the answer guide what you do next, instead of letting the reflex answer for you before you've asked anything at all. It's worth adding one further note here, because it changes how you might carry this into the days ahead. The size of a reaction is rarely proportional to how important the relationship is to you. If anything, the opposite tends to be true. The reactions run hottest exactly where the stakes of losing the person feel highest, which means your strongest reactions are often pointing you toward what matters most, not toward what's wrong with the person standing in front of you. There is something particular worth noticing about the people who stay close to you long enough to catch you mid-pattern. They are not always the people who caused the original wound. Often they're simply the ones patient enough, or steady enough, or present enough for the old pattern to finally have a safe enough place to surface. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a burden you should carry with guilt. It means the relationship that keeps triggering you the hardest might not be the most damaged one in your life. It might be the safest one you've ever had, which is exactly why the old material finally feels safe enough to come up. Tonight, if the reaction fires with someone you love, don't try to suppress it before it arrives. You've already learned that suppression was never the actual goal. Just ask the proportion question out loud if you can manage it, silently if you can't. And notice honestly whether the size of what you're feeling matches the size of what just happened in this room, tonight, with this person. Or whether you're standing in a much older room, reacting to someone who left a long time before this person ever walked in. The people closest to you were never your enemy in this. They were simply standing close enough to see it. That proximity is not the problem. It might be the only reason you're finally close enough to see it too. Chapter 10. The Room Where It Started. Personal archaeology. No victim, no villain, just origin. Somewhere there is a specific room. You have probably never gone back to look at it on purpose. Not metaphorically. An actual room, or something close enough to one, a kitchen table, a car on a specific drive, a hallway outside a door that stayed closed longer than it should have. Somewhere in your early years, a moment occurred. Ordinary enough that nobody else in the room would remember it happening. And that moment did more architectural work on the rest of your life than almost anything that came after it. You've been living downstream of that room for years without knowing its address. This chapter is not about assigning it a villain. It's about finally walking back to find it. Because a belief you can trace has power you can work with. And a belief you can't trace has power that simply runs you. Think about the belief named plainly back in Chapter 3, the one underneath your particular repetition. Whatever shape it takes for you, people leave when things get hard. You have to earn your place or lose it. Nobody's coming to help, so don't bother hoping. That belief did not arrive fully formed. It was built the way any structure gets built, from specific materials, gathered in a specific place,
over a specific and often surprisingly short span of time. Most people carry the effects of that construction for decades without ever locating the site itself. Here's why the tracing matters, beyond simple curiosity. A belief that feels like an eternal truth about the world is nearly impossible to question, because eternal truths don't need defending, they just are. But a belief that you can trace to a Tuesday afternoon when you were 7, standing in a kitchen listening to two adults decide something about your life without asking you a single question, stops being an eternal truth. It becomes an event, with a date, a location, a specific set of people who were tired and limited, and doing the best they could with what they had that day. Events can be examined. Eternal truths can only be obeyed. You may resist this exercise, and it's worth naming the resistance honestly instead of pushing past it. Going back to that room can feel like reopening something that finally closed. It isn't reopening. The room never actually closed. It's been running this entire time, quietly furnishing every relationship and every financial decision and every reflexive flinch you've felt for years. All while you told yourself it was ancient history with no bearing on your Tuesday. History that's still writing your Tuesdays isn't actually history yet. It's still present tense, wearing a disguise. Here's an important distinction, one that changes how this exercise should feel from the inside. There's a difference between blame and understanding. Blame asks who ruined this, and it needs a villain sturdy enough to hold the weight of everything that happened afterward. Understanding asks what happened here, and it doesn't require a villain at all, only an honest account of a moment where a limited person, operating with whatever resources they had that day, said or did or failed to do something that a much smaller, much more impressionable version of you absorbed as a fact about how the entire world works. Most parents who model people leave when things get hard were not cruel. They were often exhausted, themselves raised by someone who taught them the exact same lesson, passing forward a belief neither of them chose consciously. The way you're about to become the first person in the chain who actually looked at it directly instead of just carrying it forward unexamined. This is not an invitation to excuse harm that was genuinely harmful. Some rooms held real cruelty, and naming that honestly matters more than performing a forgiveness you haven't actually arrived at. But most rooms, the ordinary ones, the ones responsible for most of the quiet patterns running your adult life, didn't require cruelty to do their damage. They only required a small child, still assembling a model of how the world works, taking a single limited moment and generalizing it into a rule that then applied itself silently to every room that came after. Consider actually returning to yours tonight, not to relive it, but to look at it with the specific question this chapter is built around. What is the earliest moment you can remember where this exact feeling first showed up? The one that's been running your reactions for years. Don't search hard for it. Let it arrive the way memories actually arrive, sideways, uninvited, usually smaller and more ordinary than you expected. It is rarely a single dramatic scene. It's more often something small enough that you spent years assuming it couldn't possibly explain this much. It's worth remembering, too, that most rooms like this one hold more than a single moment. They tend to be less a single scene and more a repeated environment, the same dynamic playing out in slightly different versions across many ordinary days until the pattern simply became the water you were swimming in, too constant by the time you were old enough to notice it to register as anything unusual at all. That's part of why locating the room can feel harder than it should. You're not searching for one dramatic afternoon. You're searching for the ordinary texture of years, and ordinary things rarely announce themselves as significant while they're happening. Once you find it, resist two temptations that will both try to pull you away from what you actually found. The first is minimizing it, deciding it wasn't a big deal. Other people had it worse. You're being dramatic for even bringing it up. The second is inflating it into a full indictment of everyone involved, using it to build a case rather than simply understand an origin.
Neither temptation serves you. What serves you is simply seeing the room clearly, exactly the size it actually was, and naming plainly what a much younger version of you concluded while standing in it. Here's what changes once you've actually done this, and it's subtler than dramatic breakthrough language usually suggests. The belief doesn't disappear the moment you locate its origin. It loses something more specific and more useful than disappearing. It loses its claim to being permanent. A belief with a birthday isn't eternal. It's a conclusion, drawn by someone very young, very limited, doing the best they could with almost no other information available at the time. And conclusions, unlike eternal truths, can be revisited by someone with considerably more information than the person who first drew them. You are, right now, standing with decades more evidence than the child who built this belief ever had access to. That child concluded something true about one room, on one day, involving specific people under specific pressures, and then mistakenly generalized it into a rule about every room that would ever come after. You get to be the first person in this particular chain who looks at that generalization honestly, and asks whether it was ever actually earned by the evidence, or only by the fear of a child who had no other framework available yet. The room is still there, in memory, exactly as it was. What's different now is that you're finally old enough and far enough away to walk back into it without it swallowing you whole the way it once did. You didn't imagine it. It happened. And it was never as large as the life it went on to build. Chapter 11. Why Progress Goes Missing. The fragility of advancement. What happens without structure. How to protect what you've built. You will have a good week, and then you will lose it. Not dramatically. Quietly, the way sand leaves a hand that stopped paying attention to holding it. This is the part of the process nobody warns you about, because it doesn't fit the story arc people expect from change. The expected story goes forward in a straight line, a little better each week, until one day you've simply arrived. That story is fiction. The real shape looks more like a tide, advancing and then pulling back, and the pulling back is not evidence you failed. It's evidence you were never told the truth about how this actually works. Here's what happens in the pullback, described plainly instead of vaguely. You spend 2, maybe 3 weeks catching the half-second reliably. The proportion question from Chapter 9 starts to feel almost automatic. You begin to trust yourself in a way you haven't in years. And then, without any single dramatic trigger, you notice one evening that you didn't catch anything today, and you can't quite remember the last day you did. Nothing broke. Nothing failed. The muscle simply stopped being used, the way any muscle stops being used the moment attention moves somewhere else. This is the part worth naming honestly, because most people misread it in a way that costs them everything they'd built. The pullback feels from the inside like proof that none of it was real progress at all, just a temporary mood that wore off. That reading is almost always wrong, and it's worth understanding exactly why it's wrong, because the correction matters more than it sounds like it should. Progress on something this deep was never going to behave like a light switch, on or off, permanent once flipped. It behaves more like fitness. Nobody who stops exercising for 3 weeks concludes they were never actually getting stronger. They understand, without needing to be told, that strength requires maintenance, that stopping doesn't erase what was built, it just lets it go quiet until it's used again. You already know this about your body. You've simply never applied the same understanding to this. There's a distinction worth holding here, because confusing it is exactly what makes the pullback feel like collapse, instead of what it actually is. There's a difference between losing ground and losing the path. Losing ground means you're momentarily standing further back than you were a few weeks ago. Losing the path means you no longer know how to get back to where you were. You have not lost the path. Every tool from every chapter so far, the half-second, the proportion question, the naming of the room, still exists exactly where you left it.
What went quiet was the attention, not the knowledge. And attention is the easiest of the two to rebuild. Consider what typically causes the pullback, because it's rarely the dramatic crisis you'd expect. It's almost always something smaller and more mundane. A stretch of good weeks that made the whole thing feel finished, so you stopped applying deliberate attention to something that had briefly started to feel automatic. This is one of the strangest traps in the entire process. Early success is what most reliably causes the lapse that follows it, because success quietly convinces you that vigilance is no longer required. Right at the exact moment, vigilance is still the only thing holding the gains in place. Here's what protects the gains, and it's less dramatic than a comeback story. More like ordinary maintenance nobody ever glamorizes. You need something small and specific to check in on regularly, not because you don't trust yourself, but because everyone, without exception, drifts when nothing calls them back. This could be as simple as a single honest question at the end of each week. Did I catch the half-second at all this week, even once, even imperfectly? Not a grand audit, just a small returning the same way you'd glance at a compass on a long walk. Not because you expect to be lost, but because glancing regularly is what keeps you from drifting far enough that finding your way back becomes genuinely hard. You will be tempted, the moment you notice the pullback happening, to treat it as a reason to start over entirely, as though the previous weeks of progress no longer count, and you have to rebuild everything from the very first chapter. Resist that temptation specifically, because it's one of the most expensive mistakes available here. You do not start over, you resume. Resuming means picking the tool back up exactly where you set it down, without demanding an apology from yourself first, without requiring a dramatic recommitment ceremony before you're allowed to begin again. There's something worth understanding about why the pullback specifically threatens this particular kind of change more than other kinds. Financial habits have statements that arrive whether you're paying attention or not, forcing a kind of accountability external to your own memory. This work has no statement. Nobody sends you a monthly reminder that the half-second went quiet 3 weeks ago. The only accountability available is the one you build yourself, deliberately, because the pattern you're working against would be perfectly happy to let the whole effort fade quietly, uncontested, exactly the way it always has before. Here's what to actually do the moment you notice you've drifted, because the moment of noticing is itself valuable and shouldn't be wasted on self-punishment. Don't ask, how did I let this happen? Ask instead, simply, when did I last catch it? And what does today look like if I catch it once, just once, before the day ends? That single small return is worth more than an elaborate plan to never drift again, because elaborate plans to never drift again are themselves a form of the old pattern, the one that always demanded perfection and always used its absence as proof the whole effort had failed. There's a particular danger in treating the pullback as a referendum on your character rather than simply a predictable feature of how any new pattern gets built. Character judgments are heavy, and heavy judgments make it harder to pick the tool back up, because now you're not just resuming a practice, you're also fighting a story about what the lapse supposedly proves about who you are underneath it all. Strip the character judgment away entirely, and what's left is much lighter and much more workable. Attention wandered, the way attention always eventually wanders from anything that isn't actively demanding it. And the fix is simply to bring it back, the same ordinary way you'd notice your mind drifting during a long drive, and gently return it to the road. The tide pulls back. That was never a sign the ocean disappeared. It's simply what tides do, on a schedule that has nothing to do with whether you deserved better this week. What matters is that you know how to walk back out when it turns, and that you actually do it, without waiting for permission, without waiting to feel fully ready, without needing this pullback to be your last one before you're allowed to call any of it real. You're not starting over, you're resuming. That difference is the entire chapter. Chapter 12. Who You're Becoming Without Noticing. Identity forming, quietly, beneath conscious tracking. Somewhere in the last several weeks, you stopped being someone who occasionally catches the pattern and became someone else entirely. And you likely haven't noticed the shift because shifts like this one never announce themselves. This is worth stating plainly, because it's easy to miss from the inside. You have been measuring progress this whole time by counting catches, the half-second here, the proportion question there, tallying wins and losses the way you'd track a habit on a calendar. That counting was useful early on. It is no longer the whole story, and treating it as the whole story now will cause you to miss something far more significant that's been happening underneath the count the entire time. Think about the difference between doing something and being someone who does it. Early in this process, catching the half-second required deliberate effort, a conscious decision made in real time, the kind of thing you had to remind yourself to do. Somewhere in the last several weeks, without a specific moment you could point to, some of those catches stopped requiring the reminder. They just happened, the way you don't consciously decide to check your mirrors while driving after enough years behind the wheel. That's not a small development. That's the actual mechanism of identity change. And it's been running quietly beneath everything you've been consciously tracking. Here's the distinction that matters most in this chapter, more than any before it. There's a difference between a habit and an identity. A habit is something you do. An identity is something you are, and the difference isn't semantic, it's structural. A habit requires ongoing decision, every single time, to override whatever you'd default to otherwise. An identity doesn't require the decision anymore, because the default itself has changed. You are not fighting your way to catching the half-second the way you were in Chapter 6. Increasingly, catching it is simply what you do. The way breathing is simply what you do. No negotiation required each time. This shift didn't happen through force, and it's worth understanding why. Because the mechanism explains something important about how change actually consolidates. You didn't will yourself into a new identity through sheer determination. You built it the same slow, structural way the old belief was built back in Chapter 10, through repetition, through small moments that felt insignificant individually, and accumulated into something solid without asking your permission first. The old pattern was never defeated by a single dramatic confrontation. It was outnumbered quietly, rep by rep, by a new pattern that eventually became more familiar than the one it was replacing. Consider what this actually means for how you should think about yourself now, because the language you use here matters more than it seems. You are no longer someone trying to overcome a pattern. That framing kept you in a permanent posture of struggle, always fighting, always one lapse away from proving the struggle was the whole truth about you. A more accurate framing has been quietly becoming true this whole time. You are someone who notices, who questions proportion, who traces reactions back to their actual size instead of accepting the first story that arrives. That's not aspiration anymore. That's increasingly just a description of who you already are most days without needing to remind yourself first. This doesn't mean the old pattern is gone entirely, and it's important not to overstate what's happened here. It still shows up, particularly on the hard nights described back in Chapter 8, particularly with the people closest to you described in Chapter 9. What's changed isn't the complete absence of the old reflex. What's changed is which one now feels like home. For years, the old pattern was the default, and the half-second was the effortful exception. Somewhere in these last weeks, without a ceremony marking the moment, those two roles quietly switched places. Here's something worth sitting with, because it reframes every chapter that came before this one. All of it. The noticing in Chapter 6, the resistance in Chapter 7, the hard nights in Chapter 8, the relational collapse in Chapter 9, the archaeology in Chapter 10, the pullbacks in Chapter 11. None of it was actually about fixing individual moments. Each moment was a single vote, cast toward one identity or another, and no single vote ever determined the outcome. What determined the outcome was the accumulation, thousands of small votes,
most of them invisible even to you while you were casting them, gradually electing a version of yourself that used to feel like an aspiration and now simply feels like Tuesday. You might notice, if you look honestly, that you've stopped needing to remind yourself of some of the earlier lessons entirely. The proportion question doesn't always require conscious asking anymore. Sometimes it just runs, quietly, in the background. The way a skill you've genuinely internalized stops requiring the manual you learned it from. That's not you outgrowing the work. That's the work finishing the job it was built to do. Becoming invisible the way all mastered things eventually become invisible. Folded into the person doing them, rather than remaining a separate technique that person occasionally remembers to apply. There's a specific kind of relief available here, different from anything the earlier chapters offered, and it's worth naming directly. For years you carried the exhausting burden of having to consciously manage a pattern that felt like it was always one lapse away from taking over completely. What's been building underneath that exhausting management is something considerably more restful. A self that doesn't require constant management anymore, because the new default has become sturdy enough to hold weight on its own most days, without you standing guard over it every single hour. This doesn't mean vigilance disappears entirely, and Chapter 11 already made clear why some ongoing attention still matters. But there's a difference between vigilance that feels like constant warfare and vigilance that feels more like checking in on something that's already fundamentally sound. You've moved from the first kind toward the second, gradually. Through weeks, you mostly didn't track closely enough to notice the exact moment of transition. There's a test worth trying if you want to see this shift for yourself instead of taking it on faith. Think back to a version of the reaction that used to consume an entire evening, hours of replaying, analyzing, rehearsing what you should have said. Notice how long a similar moment holds you now. If it's minutes instead of hours, or moments instead of minutes, that shrinking isn't coincidence. That's the identity shift made measurable, visible proof that something which used to run the whole show now barely gets a walk-on part before you've already moved through it and back into the rest of your day. You are becoming action by action, the kind of person who was once only a description in an earlier chapter of this book. That person is no longer entirely ahead of you. Some days, without quite noticing when it happened, you already are them. None of this required an announcement, and it doesn't need one now either. Identity built quietly tends to hold more firmly than identity built through declaration, because it was never dependent on an audience agreeing with the story in the first place. It simply became true, the slow way, the only way anything durable has ever actually been built. Chapter 13. All of it at once. Consolidation. Every piece as a single usable system. Stand back far enough tonight, and something becomes visible that was never visible while you were living through it one chapter at a time. You've been handed pieces across 12 nights, and pieces, taken individually, can feel like separate small tools scattered across a table with no obvious relationship to each other. Tonight is for stepping back and seeing the table as a whole, because what you've actually been building this entire time was never a collection of separate techniques. It was one system, assembled in the only order it could have been assembled, each piece resting on the one before it. Start at the foundation, because everything above it depends on it holding. The weather from Chapter 1 was never really about weather. It was the first honest look at the fact that your reactions were being shaped by something upstream of the actual events triggering them. Without that first look, nothing else in this system has anywhere to attach. You cannot dismantle a mechanism you refuse to admit exists, and Chapter 1 exists to end that refusal before it can quietly run the rest of your life unchallenged. The door from Chapter 2 sits directly on top of that foundation, because knowing the mechanism exists in theory and actually being willing to look at your own specific version of it are two different thresholds, and most people stop at the first one. Functional denial is not a separate problem from the pattern itself. It's the pattern's primary defense system, The reason it survives as long as it does in people who, on some level, already suspect exactly what's happening. Walking through that door is what makes everything that follows possible instead of theoretical. The name from Chapter 3 gave the mechanism a shape you could actually work with. Confirmation bias, the lens instead of the mirror. The belief that goes looking for its own evidence. Without a name, you cannot examine a thing. You can only feel its effects and mistake the effects for facts about the world. Naming it turned a lifelong sensation into a specific, traceable process with an actual anatomy, and that anatomy is what every later chapter has been operating on directly. The weight from Chapter 4 made the stakes undeniable. It would have been possible to understand the mechanism intellectually, and still treat it as a mildly interesting fact about yourself. Low priority. Easy to set down. The honest accounting of what it has actually cost, the opportunities quietly edited out, the years spent defending a belief instead of testing it, is what turned understanding into urgency. You don't dismantle something you've filed as merely interesting. You dismantle something you've finally allowed yourself to see as expensive. The failed attempts from Chapter 5 cleared away the false conclusion that would have sabotaged everything after it. The conclusion that you'd simply never had what it takes. Without that clearing, every technique offered afterward would have landed on top of an old verdict about your own capability. And that verdict would have quietly undermined the technique before it had a chance to work. You needed to know the spreadsheet, and the promise in the car failed because they aimed at the wrong layer, not because you lacked something essential. Then came the actual mechanics, and it's worth seeing how precisely they build on each other rather than simply sitting side by side. The half-second from Chapter 6 is the entry point, the single skill everything else depends on, because you cannot apply a proportion question or trace a reaction to its origin room if you never notice the reaction happening at all. That noticing had to come before anything else practical, and it had to be small enough to actually be learnable, which is exactly why it was never presented as a grand overhaul. The resistance from Chapter 7 exists to keep you from abandoning the half-second the moment it started working, because a skill that threatens a 20-year pattern was always going to provoke defense. And knowing that in advance is what lets you recognize the defense instead of obeying it. Chapter 8 extended that same principle into the hardest conditions, the exhausted nights when the half-second is least available, because a system that only works when you're well rested was never going to hold for an actual life. Chapter 9 took the same half-second and pointed it specifically at the people closest to you, where the pattern runs fastest, and where the stakes of getting it wrong are highest. Chapter 10 went underneath all of it to find the actual room the pattern was built in, because a technique applied to a mechanism you don't understand the origin of will always feel more effortful than it needs to be. Chapter 11 protected the whole structure from the natural erosion that happens to anything left unmaintained, and Chapter 12 named what had already begun happening by that point without your explicit permission. The quiet shift from doing this to being someone who does this. Here's what becomes visible only from this distance, looking at all 13 pieces together instead of one at a time. This was never 13 separate lessons. It was one continuous argument, building toward a single claim, that the mechanism deciding the shape of your life has always been available for you to see, examine, and eventually rebuild, and that every obstacle standing between you and that rebuilding, the denial, the resistance, the exhaustion, the erosion, was itself simply more material to work with rather than evidence you should stop. There's a distinction worth holding here, one that separates people who consolidate real change from people who accumulate insight without it ever becoming structural. There's a difference between knowing 13 separate things and holding one coherent system. Knowing 13 things is trivia, useful in conversation, forgettable under pressure. Holding one system means that when the moment actually arrives, the hard night, the person you love, the old room reasserting itself, You're not reaching backward through a mental filing cabinet trying to remember which chapter applies. You're simply operating from a structure that's already integrated. The way a driver doesn't consciously recall separate lessons about mirrors and signals and following distance, they simply drive. You have that structure now, whether or not you've noticed it fully assembling itself. It has a foundation, a defense, a name, a cost that made it urgent, a clearing of the false verdict that could have stopped you early, and a working mechanism refined against real conditions, real exhaustion, real relationships, real history, real erosion. That is not a set of techniques anymore. That is an operating system, and operating systems don't need to be consciously invoked every time. They run underneath, the way the old pattern used to run underneath, except this one was built by you, on purpose, with your eyes open the entire time. Look at the table one more time before this chapter ends. The pieces were never scattered. They were always one thing, assembling itself in the only order that could have worked, waiting for tonight, when you finally had enough distance to see it as a whole instead of 13 separate nights of effort you weren't sure were adding up to anything. They were adding up the entire time. Chapter 14. The version of this that doesn't need you to notice. Permanence. Quiet, solid. No longer asking to be validated. There will come a day, and it may already be closer than you think, when none of this requires your attention at all, and that day will not feel like a finish line. It will feel like nothing, which is precisely how you'll know it happened. This is the strangest part of everything that's been built across the last 13 chapters, and it deserves to be said plainly, instead of dressed up as triumph. The goal was never for you to become someone who thinks about this constantly, vigilant forever, checking the half-second the way you'd check a wound that never fully closes. The goal was for this to eventually stop requiring checking at all, to become as unremarkable and automatic as the thing it replaced once was. You are closer to that day than you probably believe, and you will likely walk past it without noticing. The same way you walked past the first sign in Chapter 1 for years before you ever gave it a name. Think about what permanence actually looks like once it arrives, because it looks nothing like what you probably imagined at the start of this. It doesn't look like a dramatic final confrontation where the old pattern shows up one last time and loses decisively while you watch, satisfied, knowing it's over for good. It looks like an ordinary Tuesday where something happens that would have wrecked you a year ago and it simply doesn't. And you don't even register the absence of the old reaction until hours later, if you register it at all. The old you would have needed that moment to feel significant. This version of you barely notices it happened. Here's the distinction that defines this entire chapter more than any before it. There's a difference between strength that needs an audience and strength that doesn't. For most of this process, you needed to see your own progress, to count catches, to feel the relief of noticing the half-second land cleanly. That need was appropriate for where you were. It is not appropriate forever, and clinging to it past its usefulness will keep you performing recovery long after you've actually arrived at something steadier than performance requires. Real permanence doesn't ask to be witnessed. It simply operates quietly, whether or not anyone, including you, is paying close attention. Consider what this means for how you'll eventually stop needing this book, these 15 chapters, entirely. Right now, some of what's been offered still functions like scaffolding, useful language you reach for deliberately when the old pattern surfaces. Scaffolding is supposed to come down eventually. A building that still needs its scaffolding forever was never actually finished being built. The proportion question from Chapter 9, the naming from Chapter 3, the half-second from Chapter 6, all of it is doing exactly what it should be doing if, somewhere ahead of you, a day arrives where you no longer consciously reach for any of it because it's no longer separate from how you simply are. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it can feel almost unsettling rather than comforting the first time you notice it happening. You may catch yourself one evening realizing you haven't thought about any of this in weeks, not because you gave up, but because there was nothing recent enough to think about. The old pattern didn't show up loudly enough to require the tools. That absence can feel suspicious if you're used to vigilance being the price of safety. It isn't suspicious. It's what the work was always aiming toward. And the discomfort of not needing to fight for something is simply unfamiliar, not dangerous. There's something important to name about what happens to your relationship with your own history once this permanence settles in.
The room from Chapter 10 doesn't disappear, and it was never supposed to. What changes is your relationship to it. Early on, that room could still reach forward and organize an entire evening from decades away. Now it's simply a room you remember, the way you remember any formative place, without it holding operational control over what happens next. You carry the history. The history no longer carries you. Here's a distinction worth making explicit, because it protects you from a particular kind of quiet self-sabotage that tends to show up right around this stage. There's a difference between forgetting the work and no longer needing to perform it. Forgetting would mean the old pattern is simply waiting, unaddressed, for the right conditions to return unchallenged. What's actually happening, if you've done the work honestly across these chapters, is closer to the opposite. The pattern has been genuinely metabolized, integrated deeply enough that it no longer needs conscious management to stay in its proper place. You can tell the difference by testing it gently, on purpose. Bring up the old room deliberately, on a calm evening, and notice whether it still holds the same charge it once did. If the charge is gone, that's not forgetting. That's completion. This kind of permanence doesn't mean you become someone incapable of being hurt again, and it's worth being honest about that instead of overselling what's happened here. Life will still hand you moments sharp enough to genuinely rattle you. What's different is that those moments will no longer automatically detonate the entire old architecture the way they once reliably did. A hard moment is just a hard moment now, sized appropriately. No longer a doorway that swings open onto every unresolved room from your entire history at once. There's a particular kind of quiet you'll notice settling in around this. Different from the effortful calm of earlier chapters. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need you to notice it to keep functioning. It's simply there underneath everything. The way a well-built foundation doesn't need daily inspection to keep holding up the house standing on top of it. You built that foundation across 13 nights of work most people never do. Most of it invisible even to you while you were doing it. There's a specific way to check whether this permanence is actually settling in versus simply being a quiet stretch that hasn't been tested yet. Notice what happens the next time genuine pressure arrives. A real disagreement. A real disappointment. Something with actual stakes attached. The old pattern's absence during easy weeks proves very little on its own. Its absence, or its much smaller presence, during a week that would have once flattened you completely, that's the real evidence. Permanence isn't demonstrated by calm, it's demonstrated by what happens when calm runs out, and the old material gets an actual invitation to return. You are not going to feel finished the way finish lines are supposed to feel. You're going to feel, on some ordinary evening you won't remember specifically afterward, that something which used to require constant tending simply doesn't anymore. That quiet is not emptiness. It is the specific, hard-earned sound of something that no longer needs your permission to keep standing. It stands anyway. You built it too. Nothing further needs to be proven about this tonight. The foundation either holds weight or it doesn't. And the only real test is time, applied without your supervision, which is precisely the test it's now ready to take. Chapter 15. The waiting was never the wait. The open loop closes, not suspended, delivered. You were told, at the very start of this, that the waiting would end the moment you looked at it. You have been looking at it for 14 chapters now. Here is what was actually waiting on the other side. Go back to the hook that opened this book, because you owe yourself the honesty of returning to it now with everything you know. You were checking a number that wouldn't change no matter how many times you opened the app. You called it a bad month, then a bad year, then a life that kept handing you the same shape, wearing different clothes. And somewhere in that opening, a sentence landed that you may not have fully let yourself absorb at the time. You think you are waiting for things to change, but you are not. Things have been changing this entire time, in exact and faithful obedience to something you had not yet agreed to look at. You have now looked at it. 14 chapters of looking, some of it easy, most of it not. Here is what was actually true the entire time, said plainly, without the suspense this book has carried until now. Because tonight is not for suspense. Tonight is for certainty. Nothing was ever waiting on your circumstances to improve. Your circumstances were never the thing standing between you and a different life. That was the story, comfortable and familiar, that let you keep looking outward for the entire first half of your life, instead of at the mechanism actually running it. What was waiting the entire time was you, specifically your willingness to trace the weather back to its source instead of treating it as fact, to open the door instead of walking past it, to name the mechanism instead of feeling its effects, and calling them destiny. You already know this now, not as a concept, but as something you've lived across 14 nights of actual practice. You know the half-second exists because you've stood inside it, imperfectly, on good days and exhausted ones. You know the resistance has a voice, and you know that voice, however convincing, was never the same thing as truth. You know the room you came from, specifically by name, not as an abstract idea about childhood, but as an actual place with an actual date attached to it. You know the difference between a habit and an identity. And you know, because you've felt it happening in your own life, that you crossed from one into the other somewhere in these last weeks without a ceremony marking the moment. Here is the thing this entire book has been walking you toward, stated now without any hedge remaining. The thought was never separate from the life. It was never a private, contained event happening quietly behind your eyes while the real action occurred somewhere else, out there, in circumstances, in other people, in luck. The thought was the architecture the whole time. Every room you've ever stood in, every relationship that repeated its shape, every year that felt like a rerun of the year before it, was built, board by something you were doing inside your own mind long before it ever showed up as an event in your actual life. This was always the entire claim, from the very first page, and you were never going to be able to hear it clearly until you'd done the work required to test it against your own specific life, instead of accepting it as someone else's abstract philosophy. You do not accept this claim now because it was argued well. You accept it because you watched it operate in your own kitchen, on your own hard nights, with your own people, in the exact room where your own belief was first built. That is the only kind of proof that actually holds. Here is what closes tonight specifically. The open loop from the very beginning asked what you'd have left of yourself once the waiting finally ended. You now have an answer, and it is not the answer fear would have predicted. What's left is not less of you. It is you, for what may be the first time in years, no longer standing behind a lens you never chose and never examined, no longer mistaking the shape of an old room for the shape of the entire world. What's left is someone who knows, specifically and personally, that the architecture of a life is not handed down from outside. It is built, thought by thought. And what has been built by accident can be rebuilt on purpose. This does not mean the work stops tonight. Chapter 11 already told you the truth about that, and the truth still holds. The pattern will surface again, on a tired night, with someone you love, in a moment that catches you before you catch it. That is not a failure of this book. That was never the promise. The promise was never permanent immunity.
The promise was that you would stop mistaking the weather for fact, that you would know from now forward exactly where to look when the old shape starts to return. You are not the person who opened this book checking a number that wouldn't change. That person believed the number was the whole story, that the circumstance was the cause, that something out there was doing this to them. You know better now, not as information, but as something proven against your own life, in your own rooms, with your own history. The number may still be low tonight. The relationship may still need real work tomorrow. None of that has magically resolved simply because you finished a book. But you no longer stand in front of any of it the same way. You know now what's actually deciding what it means, and you know that the deciding was always yours to do. This is the legacy this entire narrative was built to leave you with, and it does not need decoration. Every circumstance you will ever face for the rest of your life will arrive exactly the same way it always has, neutral, waiting to be interpreted. What has changed is not the circumstances. What has changed is the one doing the interpreting, and that change does not reverse itself simply because a book ends. There is one more thing worth saying plainly before this closes, because it protects everything built across the last 14 chapters from quietly unraveling in the months ahead. This was never really about James Allen's book, and it was never really about the number in an account. Both were simply the nearest available door into a much larger room, the room where you finally stood still long enough to see that the architecture of a life is built from the inside, one thought at a time, whether or not anyone ever tells you so directly. Every future circumstance you meet will test whether you remember this, or quietly forget it under pressure. That is not a reason for worry. It is simply the ongoing shape of a life lived with your eyes open instead of closed. The weather was never the forecast. It was always something you were building. You know how to build something else now. You already have. The Architecture of Thought, a narrative based on As a Man Thinketh by James Allen.